Thanks, Carol, and thanks everyone else, and thanks to the Foundation for giving me this opportunity to give this presentation and win this fabulous award. I have done some consulting for the pharmaceutical and device industry, largely aimed at developing strategies to treat cognition and negative symptoms with pharmacological or technological interventions. All the data that are being presented here today, though, are funded by the NIMH or the Department of Veterans Affairs, and I have a number of collaborators who are also investigators with me and PIs on some of these projects as well. There are a lot of different symptom domains in schizophrenia, including psychotic symptoms, which include delusions and hallucinations, communication disorders, negative symptoms, and cognitive impairments. What's interesting about these symptoms is that on a cross-sectional basis, they don't seem to be correlated with each other in terms of their severity, but they all arise concurrently in people who have this diagnosis of schizophrenia. So we've studied a lot of the different elements here. Today I'm going to try to talk about some commonalities, some things that may be similar across these symptom domains. So what do they share? Challenges in self-assessment is a predominant central feature. Hallucinations, those are voices that seem real, but they aren't really there. Delusions, those are ideas that people get that are very persistent, that aren't based in any objective environmental reality. Cognitive functioning is commonly misestimated, as are functional abilities, and I'll show you some of our data on that, because we have some ideas about why that happens, and maybe now how we can treat that. Mood states are reported incongruently, and I'm going to show you some of our information we've collected using momentary assessments of moods. And communication disorders may themselves arise from confusions about whether or not you've told someone previously about something that you're now talking about. If you can't tell the difference between what you're thinking about saying and what you said, you can wind up communicating in a way that other people simply can't comprehend. So let me give you some examples. In this study that I did with Rich Keefe, we developed a self-reported informant rating scale to evaluate neurocognitive performance and related the ability of patients and informants who knew them to generate ratings that correlated with neuropsychological test performance. Informants can generate ratings of patients' cognitive impairment that are nicely correlated with the patient's performance, but the patient's self-reports of cognition correlate zero with their performance. Not negatively, not positively, but zero on average. When we ask patients' case managers to rate their vocational ability and ask the patients to rate it on the same rating scale, the correlation turned out to be zero. And we were prompted to do this study by a previous finding where we saw that there was only 30% agreement between patients with schizophrenia and their case managers about whether or not the patient had a job. And when you think about having a job or not, that seems to be a fairly fundamental thing that you'd be aware of. But the correlation was 30%. So we started getting really interested in identifying what could be leading to that. And we discovered that when we talked to different patients with schizophrenia, this is a different study entirely, we found that people with schizophrenia who had never been employed rated themselves as more capable at vocational functioning, as well as other everyday activities, than people with schizophrenia who right now had a full-time job. So we're seeing a disjunction at the level of self-evaluation of competence as well as an actual occurrence. When we asked people with schizophrenia to tell us how happy and sad they were at the same time using ecological momentary assessment strategies, and this is something that people with bipolar disorder do all the time. You ask people to give you a mood rating. How happy are you? How sad are you? Well, this is the heat map of what we saw over 4,300 surveys. What's important about that? Healthy people commonly will tell you that they are more happy when they're less sad, or less sad when they're more happy. But what we saw in our patients with schizophrenia is that 35% of the surveys reported the presence of moderate or higher levels of both positive and negative moods at the same time, while 20% of our patients in the upper left-hand corner told us that they were absolutely never, ever sad over the course of 90 surveys, scores of 1 on a 7-point scale. So we're seeing that there are incongruent reports in the mood domains. So we see self-evaluation of functioning, self-evaluation of cognition, and reports of moods are just not matching up to what they probably should be on a normative basis. So let's talk about why a zero correlation is not random responding. It's not unmotivated responding. People with schizophrenia are very willing to offer opinions, commonly without maybe as much information as they need to come to conclusions, but they're not unwilling to answer a question. What we also see is that cognitive performance is not the cause of response bias, because it doesn't correlate. Whether or not you over or underestimate doesn't correlate with your capability. Your capability correlates with your absolute value misestimation. So being right about your performance is correlated with performance, but what you say when you're wrong is not. What we also see is that there are several systematic descriptions previously of these phenomena: jumping to conclusions, bias against disconfirmatory evidence, liberal acceptance. Those are conceptual terms and they sound a little bit pejorative, but we have found some really neuroscience underpinnings of some of those things. People with schizophrenia have a markedly enhanced generation effect. They are much better able than healthy individuals to benefit from self-generating a story and remembering it. So self-generated information is remembered very well. Further, there's faster acquisition of false memories. So if you do source monitoring studies with people with schizophrenia, they will more rapidly than healthy individuals come to the conclusion that they'd actually experienced something that they never experienced. Now, those are both beneficial cognitive abilities. Rapid learning, having a good generation effect, but maybe those things combine together to lead to some other challenges. So I'm going to show you data from 2 tests, both of which are momentary performance and judgment tests. One is a variable difficulty memory test, and the other one is a metacognitive version of the Wisconsin card sorting test. Both can separate preferential retention of self-generated information from objectively available information. In the variable difficulty memory test, there's one condition that is so easy that people with schizophrenia get all right the first time they get exposed to it. Then there's another condition where you have to learn with practice, and one condition that's too hard to learn everything. So what we can do is we can look at how people do when they got everything right the first time, and we present the tests of them over and over again and ask them how they did on subsequent exposures. And I think that's actually really interesting, keeping in mind that the recognition foils and the target items are repeatedly presented. But some are identified as targets and some are clearly foils. They're only presented at recognition. After every trial, we ask people, how many did you get right? Then on trials 2 and 3, we said, did you get better with practice? And we asked at the end, did you improve overall? So here's the learning curve for trial length 6. People do get it all right the first time, but over time, they're up to saying they got 8 out of 6 words correct. All right? And here's the origin of that. Basically, what we're seeing is that there is a subjective learning curve that keeps increasing, because the subjective learning curve includes the false recognitions of the recall foils. So people are remembering the target items and also the foils saying that they're part of the target stimuli, and they're remembering that completely. So they're remembering everything they thought they recalled. And so there's the challenge is they're not discriminating between target and foil information, but they're not forgetting what they thought. And if you look at trial length 12, you see exactly the same thing. People who say they improve in their learning curve learned the recognition foils and reported them back. So what does this mean? This means that self-reports are completely congruent with momentary decisions, that there is 100% retention of what you thought was correct. So you can't say their memory's bad because they got the trial length 6 task done with 100% fidelity on the first trial. But over time, they probably had enough extra cognitive resources hanging around to start paying too much attention to the foils, remembering them as well. So at the end of the day, what we're seeing is that retention of the self-generated information is close to perfect. So let's switch and talk about the Metacognitive Wisconsin card sorting test. People are familiar with the WCST. It's a problem-solving test. There's three domains: color, form, and number, and you have to learn by experience. But we changed the test, along with Amy Pinkham's help. So we changed the test so the person sorts the card, and then we ask them, did you get it right? And then we said, well, how sure are you? And then we tell them whether or not they were right. So everyone makes a decision about their sorting that's overt, and we can record that, and then they get their feedback. So what you find is that people with schizophrenia get about half of the sorts correct on the Wisconsin card sorting test. They're in there at about 30 out of 64. People with bipolar disorder are significantly better. But if you look at those sort of orange bars, what you see is both groups manifest a substantial bias toward thinking they're right on every single sort. So the idea was they're saying, yeah, I'm right, I'm right, I'm right. But when we look at the percent of correct decisions when they're right or not, the schizophrenia patients are right half the time. Well, if you have a dichotomous choice and you're right half the time, that looks like that's random responding, because there's no correlation between whether or not you were right and what you said. And the bipolar patients actually are more frequently correct about whether or not the sort was correct. But let's look at the most interesting part of this. When we asked people at the end of the test, how'd you do? The people with schizophrenia gave us a response that correlated 0 with how many times they were actually correct, but was highly correlated with how often they thought they were correct. So it's not like they're responding at random. That 0 correlation is due to basing your decision about your correctness on what you remember about your responding. Look at the bottom, people with bipolar disorder. They had just as many false positive responses as the people with schizophrenia, but at the end of the day, when they're judging their performance, they're not correlating that with their yes responses. They're correlating that with how many trials they actually got right. So the people with bipolar disorder are sorting, then they're saying, oh yeah, I'm right, and they're hearing, oh no, you're wrong, and then they're remembering the feedback that they got. And so if we look at prior decision accuracy and the likelihood of having a subsequent correct decision, what we see is that with the schizophrenia patients, if they were right or wrong about their previous decision, they're just as likely to be right or wrong about the next one. Whereas with bipolar patients, there's a cascade. If you were right, if you sorted color, and you thought you were right and you were told you were right, you were likely to make a correct decision about your next sort, which was also going to be on color. So we see that what's happening here is there's this cascade of influence of external information on people's decision-making, whereas the people with schizophrenia are having no problem remembering what they said, but they're not basing their decisions about their performance on what they heard about it. They're basing it on what they thought about it on a momentary basis. So it's not a memory problem, it's not a decision-making problem, it's a bias in terms of valuing external versus internal information. So apparently random responding is not random at all. So you can't say that people with schizophrenia don't pay attention to what they're doing, or they're not exerting enough effort to give you a correct response. They're giving you a response that's correct, but it's based on the wrong information. It's an accurately, fully aggregated collection of information that is not externally generated, it's internally generated. So what do you do about something like that? Well, you try to develop an intervention that teaches people to focus on external information. You try to develop an intervention that teaches people how to solve problems on a completely momentary basis. So in this project, which I'm doing with Amy Pinkham, who's coming up next, and Colin Depp at UCSD, we're developing a hybrid technology and in-person training program that is designed to use previous principles of CBT, where you teach people to not pay attention to the origin of their delusions, but now we use principles of CBT to get people to pay attention to the origin of their impressions about their functioning and their performance. So we take that variable difficulty memory test that we gave to people beforehand, and after a couple trials, we just asked them, how many words did we ask you to remember? And if the person can't tell you how many words they were supposed to remember, they're probably not going to be able to remember it at the end of the day. And there are other higher level graduated interventions that we're applying, but our idea is using CBT type principles, practicable on a momentary basis with a device, interspersed with in-person sessions, sort of like bridging groups that you do with computerized cognitive training, to develop the ability to evaluate your performance on a momentary basis, to consider external feedback as well as what you thought about things, and to consider judgments going forward that are broadly informed. Because after all, I have another one. Self-knowledge is a goal on its own. And we know from history and from other people who are interested in this topic, like David Dunning, that knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know is really a critical path forward in terms of functioning and essentially making gains. If you know you have a challenge, you need to accept the treatment for the challenge. If you think you've mastered something, you need to have some evidence of mastery. And that's where we are right now. It took us a while to get here, but this is our next project going forward to try to do an intervention that's based on several decades of neuroscience work, based on real legitimate cognitive processes that aggregate to lead to challenges in self-assessment. Thank you very much.
Standing up. Is this on? Okay. I'm wondering if what you're perceiving as the block of the internal responses really relate to the fact that they are having so much happening in their brain, like voices, hearing voices, those kind of internal stimuli versus the external.
Historically, what we have found, that's what I started out by saying, is that there's not much of a correlation between cognitive abilities and these psychotic symptoms. But you have a very good point. We just published a paper last year where we showed that people with schizophrenia who were reporting greater momentary experiences of psychotic symptoms gave us reports of their functioning that were implausible. So that we had people who were home for like 85 out of 90 EMA surveys over 30 days. But some of those people told us that they were better at taking the bus than people who were employed full-time. But you can't take the bus at home. So giving us a report of a completely implausible functional act, so that's a bias, right? And people who are having more psychotic symptoms were manifesting more of that response bias. Now, the question is, do the symptoms cause the bias, or does the bias cause the symptoms? Because there's been a lot of work on misestimation of functioning and misestimation of what you're doing and how that leads to delusions and hallucinations such as paranoia arising from lack of social contact combined with lack of awareness of your lack of social contact.
Is there another question? Thank you. Did you include in your study there people who did not have schizophrenia or bipolar?
We have used healthy controls in our studies looking at ecological momentary assessment and things like that. That's where we understood that people with schizophrenia have better performance on tests that involve the generation effect and are faster to learn information that they're presented repeatedly. One of the challenges in using healthy people as a reference group when you're studying disability is that disability is uniformly absent in healthy people and uniformly present in people with serious mental illness, so there's not much of a control there. But for all of our studies with cognitive processes and things like that, we are definitely interested in looking at healthy controls as well. Because one of the things that people have overlooked and that we have discovered fairly recently is that cognitive impairments in bipolar disorder and in schizophrenia are more similar than they are different. So looking at cognitive performance in people with bipolar disorder is not a comparison group for people with schizophrenia.
If I can follow up, my reason for asking the question is because, I come across people throughout my life who are not good at self-assessment in a variety of ways, and in many instances has to do with a low self-esteem or low self-confidence, and that can lead to them over saying how good they feel or under. And so what does that tell you then about what you're observing there, given that with people who don't have mental illness and then the people that have mental illness? Well, and then just, if I can say one last so I can give this up, with what you found there, what does this do to help us understand schizophrenia, people with schizophrenia, and how we respond to them? Well,
healthy people are notoriously bad at self-assessment. And there are a number of phenomena that correlate with that, sex, gender being one of them. And the fact is that we published a study showing that healthy people and people with schizophrenia both underestimated their everyday functioning if they reported themselves as being somewhat sad. But the interesting phenomenon was the level of sadness in the healthy people was a Beck Depression Inventory score of 6. And it was 24 in the schizophrenia patients. So even low-level sadness can impact on people's self-assessment, and that's been studied in bipolar disorder as well. The impact of mood state on self-assessment in schizophrenia has turned out to be smaller than we previously anticipated, but it's quite large in bipolar disorder. In fact, there's a gradient of misestimation and of functioning and of activities that starts with simple sadness. Lou Judd many years ago showed that in people with bipolar disorder, people who said that they were not depressed but they were sad had more disability than people who said that they weren't sad at all. And we just recently published a paper showing that your momentary level of sadness predicts doing more versus less productive things on a momentary basis. So if you say, I'm really sad, you may actually be too sad to even watch television. People who are really sad were resting or sleeping. People who are moderately sad were watching television. People who are not sad, when they were home, they were cooking and cleaning and doing their homework. So there's definitely a mood gradient in bipolar disorder. What we're seeing in schizophrenia is that gradient seems to be linked a little bit more to psychotic symptoms, and that's why we're hopeful that our intervention to improve self-assessment may also have a rub-off effect on psychosis as well.